So, why am I talking about elms and morels? Some of you may have heard that elms are associated with morels, and I don't find a lot of morels, unfortunately, since I found a lot the first year I joined the club. However, um, there are some people who have claimed that they find a lot of morels underneath of elms. And so I thought maybe I'd improve my chances by starting to research this myself. And I'm going to post on the chat when I have a chance links to 3 videos to talk about uh, finding and identifying elm trees. One of those in particular is done in Pennsylvania, kind of central eastern Pennsylvania, which is pretty close to us. And it seems like it's something worth doing even now. I also talked to one of our morel experts, Tim Geho, who did our um, explanation of how to find morels, and it's posted on our website. And he said that he's finding less and less elms, of course, because the Dutch elm disease is killing the American elms. Now, that's a bad thing, of course, but it's also a good thing in the sense that elm trees apparently only produce morels when they're dying. So what I wanted to do was explain to you what is going on with elm trees so that you can do some preliminary scouting this spring, which I think is possible to do, and also identify them just when you're walking around in the woods. What Tim told me is that when he was walking around in the woods and he'd be looking under all the other trees that may produce morels as well, he would be noting the elm trees and in particular looking for elm trees that were just dying. And the reason for that is that if you catch them right when they're dying and the bark is starting to come off, that's when they're going to have a big flush. And he says maybe a year, 2 years. And then if you keep on going back every once in a while, it will produce morels again. But more importantly, these morels are the relatively large yellow morels, esculentes, I think. Mitch, if you want to correct me on that, it might be Americana, it might be the cryptic version, but they're bigger than the ones we usually find under tulip poplars. And they make up, maybe 4 of the ones we find under the tulip poplars around here, which are the Morchella virginianii. So what I wanted to do was go through a relatively quick review, and this will be posted to our YouTube, so you can go through it again, and you'll have links to some other videos that will talk about finding elm trees and how they produce morels. But I think it is worth looking into. I did a lot of research because I don't find a lot of elm trees or morels on this. And I even ran into a website that referred to the Association of Elm Trees and Morels as mythical. I don't think that's true based on the people that I'm talking to. And it remains to be seen. Maybe they're just a frustrated morel hunter, or maybe they're looking under live elms. So first thing, let's see, how can I switch to that? Here we go. So the first and easiest thing is, what does the base of an elm tree look like? They're pretty unusual, and they're unusual in the sense that they have these very elongated above ground roots. And they only develop this after they get maybe a foot or more than a foot in diameter. The young ones won't have this, but this is not the only tree that does this. Beeches have kind of large footprints like this too, but this is very diagnostic of elm trees. and particularly the older elm trees and the elm trees that are dying. Now, and before the leaves come out, it's kind of hard to identify an elm tree unless you really know what you're looking for. In addition to the base, the bark is, to my eyes, kind of nondescript. There are two kinds of elm trees. There's slippery elms and there's American elms. And the American elms are the ones that are, actually, I think maybe both of them, but the American elms in particular are affected by the beetles that spread fungus and ultimately kill the trees. And so we used to have a lot of elm trees, but we don't anymore. To me, these the bark on a American elm tree looks sort of grayish, and those are the three on the left-hand side. And the bark, I'm not sure about the other one. It was a little bit more brownish, but I'll show you a separate bark shot of a slippery elm. Both slippery elms and American elms do seem to produce morels. To me, this bark looks like somewhat like a tulip poplar, except that it's very flat on the surface. Some people refer to it as creating diamond shapes, which you might be able to see here in some of the way the ridges are formed, but it's flat on the top. More importantly, though, is the American elm tree. If you cut the bark off and or peel off a piece of bark and cut it as a cross section, it looks like an Oreo cookie. It has cream sections and dark sections. The slippery elm does not have this. So this is one way to tell whether you're dealing with an American elm or a slippery elm. And sometimes, based on my experience, those white lines are relatively thin, but this was a good example I found on some that I went looking at up by Olney a couple of days ago. Here's another example. Left-hand side is the American elm, X's, diamond shapes. On the right-hand side is the slippery elm. Slippery elm is scaly, kind of looks like it's peeling, and it's said to be more reddish brown than the kind of brown gray of an American elm. The other thing to notice here is this is very typical of both of the elms, which is they kind of sprout these little whiskers, which is kind of looks like an old witch with a whisker coming out of her chin. They all up and down the bark. You may see these tiny little twigs, and again, it's probably not the only tree that does this, but this seems to be pretty typical of elm trees. Here's another example of another one that it was a dead one, and I took a picture of it a couple of years ago. I was going through my pictures and said, oh my God, that's an elm tree. And I'm not sure I found any morels underneath it or not, but I was taking pictures out in the woods. And this one was probably a slippery elm. Another way to recognize elm trees is to look at the buds that are coming out. And they alternate along the sides of the twigs. And you can see these relatively far away when you're looking at them. They kind of look like little footballs before they come out. And the slippery elm is said to have, though I haven't been able to verify this myself, they have copper-colored hairs on them. The interesting thing you'll find out from one of these videos is that it's said that elm trees bud out and have their green kind of flowers earlier in the season, about the same time that tulip poplars do. And if you're driving along the side of the road in a rural area, you might be able to spot these from the side of the road and find an area where elm trees are growing. And in particular, and I'll show you a little bit more, there's something about the flowers and the seeds that are produced early in the season is going to really help you find elm trees. Here's an example of an elm a couple of days ago. The buds are starting to come out. They're a little bit purplish. And again, what you'll see when you're looking up in the tree is more activity than a lot of the other trees right now. Information on the internet is a little bit varying as to what these colors are. What I found was something that said the slippery elm was pink and purple. I know this elm tree is an American elm. In fact, it's an elm that it was the same one that had the bark that I was showing you with the Oreo cookie-like appearance. Now these are going to turn into a larger flower, and the flowers, and here's an example of what it looks like, are going to produce seeds. And these seeds are little flat discs, maybe a centimeter across, very tiny. But the American elms, as you can see, have a fuzzy edge to it. And they have a notch at the top. When an elm tree blooms in the spring and these dry up a little bit, they fall off in massive quantities. And if you look around on the ground underneath the elm tree, you'll be able to see these very easily in the spring. And I know this because I have an American elm tree in my backyard, and all this stuff gets in my pool. So it's very reliable. Here's another example that illustrates the difference between an American elm, fuzzy, a notch, and here's another one, fuzzy and a notch up at the top, and the slippery elm. It's not fuzzy. It does have a little bit of hair in the middle, right over the seed in the center, but these things are going to come out early, and you're going to be able to see this early in the spring at the time when morels are out to decide what kind of elm tree you're dealing with. Report back to the club whether you find more under slippery elms or American elms. One of the videos I had really seemed to be indicating that it was the slippery elms that were more productive, but that may be because the other elms are dead. Here's another example. There's a picture from my backyard. You can see that again, it's fuzzy, and this is what the leaves look like. We'll have some other close-ups, but when you collect the leaves, these are called samaras. When you collect these after they've fallen down and aged a little bit, they're going to lose the fuzz on it. So what you're looking for is fresh ones that are on the tree that will be able to help you distinguish between an American elm and a slippery elm. What do the leaves look like? They're sawtooth on the edge. These are dead leaves that I picked up from my backyard from my elm last year. The other thing that's useful this time of year when you're out looking for elm trees is that they're dark brown. And when they get rained on, they're even darker. And so when you're walking around, if you see a lot of dark brown leaves on the ground, it may be an indication that you're nearby an elm tree. And secondly, what I found is being out in the woods, if you get down and look at the leaves, you can find some of these. They don't blow away or curl up too much. And they're, I think, very distinctive. They're, you can see on the tip, it's a very pointy tip. They're oblong. And a very distinctive characteristic is that they're sort of lopsided down at the bottom. One edge extends lower than the other edge. And that seems to be true of both of the elm trees. Here's a close-up, and sometimes they say that the edges of these are double sawtooth. Sometimes it's hard to see, but this is a real close-up, and what I'm pointing to is kind of these red lines are pointing to the second tooth that are in between the larger tooths of this. But I don't think that's really essential, and I think it varies somewhat. What's really characteristic is this oblong shape, the sawtooth edge, the lopsided bottom like this, and the very pointy tip. So what does an elm tree look when you're far away from it? This is the one in my backyard. The American elm tree really spreads out, was a great shade tree. And one of the things that you'll notice here, first of all, I have a double stemmed one, but the branches tend to come out more laterally and create a huge amount of shade underneath it if they are separated from other trees. Tim Kehoe tells me that out in the woods, both these and the slippery elms will be more narrow and kind of vase shaped, but they won't really spread out like this. And this is one I took last week, and you can kind of see the buds are starting to come out on the top here. Here's another one that I was out looking at up by Olney a couple of days ago. Again, spreads out, a lot of lateral movement in the branches that come out. And again, it's kind of showing these reddish buds right now up at the top. And another thing that's said to be diagnostic about these, to distinguish this from the slippery elm, is that the American elm has kind of V-shaped crotches, and that the slippery elm has more of a U shape. I haven't seen enough slippery elms to really tell you whether that makes it is really helpful. Now, this is what you're really looking for. Elms, very typically, when they die, and you can see that flaring base, the bark will peel off in long strips. It'll be hanging from the tree. It'll be down on the floor of the forest nearby the tree. And what you're looking for is an elm tree that is relatively newly losing its bark and dying. And so when you're walking through the woods, you're looking for dead elms. But in order to find a place to look for elms, you need to find a place where there's some living elms. And that's what I would recommend you do, which is drive around or walk through the woods and try to find places where there are living elms. And then you'll start to look for the dead elms. And those are the ones that you're going to mark in your mind for the future to come back next year and the year after and the year after until they start to produce. Here's another example of what you're looking for out in the woods. You're looking for a tree that's starting to die and they have cracks in the bark. And once you see that, you know that that tree is not doing very well and it's going to die at some point. And so you keep coming back year after year to watch this one because it may well produce a big flush of big morels. This is an example of another one that's showing these little growths, what I think of as little whiskers on the tree that go all the way up the stem. And even though the tree is completely dead, there are these little whiskers. And I don't know whether they're really live or not. When I go out later in the spring, I'll check that out. So on the left-hand side, this is what you're hoping to find underneath your morel, the elm trees. There are a lot of other trees that do produce. Tim tells me, in particular, oak trees and ash trees are productive. And he's somewhat encouraged that the ash trees, though they're being killed by the emerald ash borer, are not killed to the root, because the emerald ash borer has girdled the tree as opposed to infected it with a fungus. And he's seeing that the ash bases are starting to produce shoots, so they may come back again. And on the right-hand side is an example of maybe 4 or 5 different things I sometimes photograph of things that'll get your heart racing when you're far away. And you might think that that's a morel, and you get close to it and you're disappointed, and it's something else. And this happens to be a kind of like Indian pipe, a non-photosynthesis symbiotic plant that grows, and it's called Canophilus americana. But it sometimes looks, when you're looking around in the woods, like you might have found some morels. So that's all I really had to say about this. I would encourage you to take a look at the videos that I'm going to post and go around and look around for elm trees. The place you want to look for elm trees is what they call bottomland or lowlands around water. A stream and is a good place to look where the area is going to be flooded a little bit. It's not necessarily going to be right on the bank, but it's going to be in that area. And so when you're driving around, you see little bridges that cross over, even in the DC area. There are these drain areas that have streams in them and little floodplains. And we do have a lot of elm trees. Tim was telling me there's a number of them downtown. And I live in downtown Silver Spring, and even there you can find. There's one in my backyard, and there are some others in the neighborhood as well.